So I want to talk about something known as the Schrödinger bridge problem. It's something that many of you might not have heard. So it's this was from a paper from Schrödinger in the 1930s, almost 100 years ago. It kind of fell into oblivion for a long time, but it's kind of gotten a revival recently, and it's relevant for a few different applications that are relevant for the theme of this conference. And I want to motivate this using something that we heard something about yesterday. But it turns out to be related to a bunch of different areas that connects kind of all of us. So the specific connection to biophysics is in analyzing single cell RNA sequencing data. Okay, so that's really the primary driver for why I'm going to talk about this today. Right. So the idea here is that when you do a single cell RNA sequencing assay, what you get are samples at distant particular instance of time, right? So you kind of sequence a bunch of cells. These cells are destroyed in the process, but what you get are some estimate of their state. So I'm going to draw this as time. So this is time axis. And let's say for simplicity, the state is defined by two variables, G1 and G2. So these are the Y and Z axes. And what you get are a bunch of points that live at time t equal to 0. Right? So this is t equal to 0. So you're going to get a bunch of points over here. Right? So that's one measurement that you get from these assays. Now, what you typically do is that you have a tissue, right? So now you destroy that tissue in this process. But what you can do is you kind of let the tissue kind of grow for longer, for instance, or you apply a particular perturbation, and you perform the same analysis here, right? So you kind of repeat the assay, and you collect the state of these cells at a different time point. So let's call this time point t equal to capital T, and then you get a bunch of samples over here. So let's draw these axes again. And what you have are a bunch of samples here. And potentially these samples, the distribution of these samples is very different from the ones over here because you've applied a particular perturbation, or potentially these cells are differentiated into multiple types. So you get potentially one cluster over here and one cluster over here. So this from the same population, right? So these are completely different cells. The cells are destroyed when you kind of collect this data. So this is a completely different set of cells. So the goal of optimal transport of the Schrödinger bridge problem over here is to kind of map points over here to points over here, right? So what you're trying to do is to effectively find a way to map cell with this state to cells in the state. So for simplicity, we're going to assume that the number of cells over here are equal to the number of cells over here. In practice, there's going to be differences, and there's various ways to correct for those differences, but we're going to ignore that. So you want to kind of map points over here to points over here, this point over here to this point over here. But of course, you want this map to be somewhat reasonable, right? So you don't want to create an arbitrary map. There's infinitely many ways you can map points over here to points over here. But you want something sensible. You kind of want this mapping to be smooth, and you want it to be efficient in some ways, right? So you kind of want a reasonable map. And that's the kind of problem that we're dealing with. The way this problem is formulated is in the optimal transport frame. So this is a completely different field of statistics and computer science. And this deals with something known as optimal transport. And the way it's formulated is the following. The idea is that you have, let's say, a distribution. I'm going to assume for now it's one-dimensional. So you have here some kind of Gaussian distribution at time t equal to 0. And you want to transform this distribution to some other distribution at time T equal to capital T, right? And this distribution can be arbitrary. So both of these distributions can be completely arbitrary. So I have a distribution I'm going to call rho 0, G0. And you have a final distribution rho T, GT. And you want to have this mapping to be reasonable, right? So you kind of don't want to map points from here to here. Ideally, you want to map points from here to somewhere over here. You want to move mass as little as possible. The way optimal transport is formulated is to say that you have particular marginals for your distribution, but you want the joint. But you want a joint in such a way that the cost of moving particles from here to here is minimized. The Schrodinger bridge problem is one version of this problem where things are particularly nice, which means that you can extend these kind of algorithms to high dimensions, and you can do a lot of other things with them. You can fit neural networks to these velocity fields and so on. And that turns out to be quite important. So once you can start fitting neural networks to these velocity fields, so you get a velocity field out of these problems, you train a neural network to fit that velocity field, you can start generalizing. So for instance, in this case, what you're going to get is a flow field, right? So there's going to be a velocity that comes out of it, which I'm going to denote by V. This is the key quantity that we want to find when we solve this problem. This is going to be a function of G. It's going to be a function of T. It's going to be a function of the cell's context. And let's say this context is embedded in some d-dimensional space. I'm going to call it psi context. And you're going to get some other embedding of all the perturbations that you've done in this assay, right? So you have this complicated velocity field which depends on the context and the perturbations that you make. The power of this approach really comes about when this is a neural network. In that case, you can plug in different embeddings for the context and perturbations, and you can start generalizing to new contexts and perturbations that you've never seen before, right? So this is the idea of combining machine learning with various omics data sets. And this is one dominant approach that folks are proposing in the last few years. Okay, so in this lecture, I kind of want to give you a simple example where how we can find this velocity field, kind of the basis of the theory for finding these kinds of velocity fields. A lot of the theory can look familiar, but it's slightly non-standard. Even if you learned control theory, for example, it's going to look slightly different. But before I kind of expand on the theory, I kind of want to connect this framework to a few other things that we're also familiar with potentially. One of them is generative modeling and diffusions. So it turns out that this basic conceptual framework is really the same framework that one thinks about when you think about diffusion and flow models that you've probably seen with OpenAI and Sora and all. So you kind of type in your prompt and you get an image. So this is the same framework that underlies those kinds of models. And the idea there is that you start with a Gaussian random variable and you transform that into some complicated data distribution. And the prompt comes in as an embedding vector, almost exactly like this. So there's really analogs between the two. And in fact, it's really the same techniques. It turns out that this is fundamentally connected to stochastic thermodynamics. And there's this idea of a thermodynamic speed limit, which tells you how much entropy you're going to produce when you transform a state from one to another in finite amount of time. And this is, in fact, the same calculation that I'll be doing is the same calculation that you would do to derive those limits. Yeah. Yeah. Details of how you take steps. Yeah. In optimal transport, are there any constraints other than just the loss of the final distribution? There's some flexibilities in how you can formulate it. I'm going to present like the simplest one, but you can extend it in different ways. Okay, so it's related to stochastic thermodynamics in the sense that you can derive speed limits using this framework. It's related to stochastic optimal control, but again, it's slightly different because in optimal control, what you do is that you take particles from one point to another by minimizing some kind of action. But what you're doing here is to transport the whole distribution. So it's going to be slightly different, but we're in fact going to use that framework to derive whatever we're going to derive going forward. So there's There's connections to stochastic control theory. And this is something that I'd like to kind of propose, which is that this is also a really good framework for describing developmental decision-making, right? So I think this is an alternative framework to think about Waddington landscapes. And I'll explain why this is the case. And I hope this is somewhat convincing that this is something worth thinking about. Okay, so I'm going to use this kind of setup to set up the problem. The size here are just some embedding vectors for the context. So for example, a perturbation can be some molecule. You can use a graph neural network to embed that molecule in some d-dimensional space. You plug that into a neural network that takes that d-dimensional vector as an argument. And you do this for many different molecules. And hopefully, if you do this for enough molecules, to start generalizing to new molecules. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're going to be solving like a value function problem. So it's going to be solved through dynamic programming, which is really the backwards process. Physical meaning. Well, the optimization process does not have a physical interpretation, but the dynamics is quite natural. So in fact, like kind of following up on that. So the way we're going to model this is to say that there are these particles over here, which have state G0 initially. And the dynamics of these particles is going to follow the stochastic differential equation. Right, so this is a really simple stochastic differential equation. This is a time-dependent drift term, and this is the noise. Just to be precise, this is mean 0, and it has variance dt, and it's delta correlated, right? So this is standard Brownian motion with drift. And the goal is to find this velocity field, right? So that's pretty much the statement of the problem. And there's constraints, which is that you have the distribution, the density at time t, and we are saying that the density is constrained such that at time t equal to 0, you have rho 0, and at time capital T, you have rho t. One other way of formulating the stochastic differential equation is to write it as a Fokker-Planck equation. I'm going to assume that you know how to do this, but it's really like not particularly complicated, even if you don't know. So the idea there is to describe the evolution of the density rather than individual particles. And the forward equation has this form. This is the partial derivative with respect to time. So that's just the Fokker-Planck equation for this system. I'm writing it down here because I'm going to use it later. Right? Otherwise, we don't have to specify it really. All right. Okay. Okay. So if you look at this, I mean, you might think that given these conditions, there's going to be a unique way that solves this problem, but that's not true. You can always take this particle from here to here in many different ways, right? So you can take this path, but you can also take a path like this, and you can take a path like this. So the problem as specified here is ill-defined. You need one more constraint, and that constraint is somewhat like an action that you need to specify. And the Schrodinger-Bridge problem, you specify one particular form for this action, which makes it tractable. And that is, yeah.
Here, you put an endpoint for the particle. That also is choice, right?
Yeah, the assignment of the particle to a particular endpoint is a choice, but it needs to satisfy globally this constraint. So I'm going to define the reward function. It's not a cost, it's something you maximize. You need to maximize this over the velocity field. Again, everything is in 1D in what I'm going to be talking about just for simplicity, but you can extend this to any dimensions that you want. You can also extend this to diffusions and some other drift term. And I won't expand on that. This particular objective is going to be a quadratic objective, so you can think of this almost as a kinetic energy. Sorry, I didn't write it properly. So it's going to be the expected kinetic energy. Okay. With the constraints that tell me if the font ever becomes too small. I've been actively trying to suppress the urge to kind of make it optimal for myself, but suboptimal for you. Okay, so this is the objective that that we are trying to maximize. You can immediately see that it looks like a control problem, right? So you want to get particles from one place to another and minimize the quadratic cost. This makes sense because we're just saying you don't want the velocity field to go every which way, the trajectories to go every which way. We want to kind of favor straight trajectories, right? Now, you'd be tempted to kind of use the standard control formalism for this, but it doesn't really work because of this additional constraint on the final density. But we can actually circumvent that. We're going to change this objective slightly by introducing Lagrange multipliers, right? So we have a constraint. The best thing we can do is add a Lagrange multiplier. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's just an abstract state variable for now. Yeah. I mean, you can set the density to 0 if G's. First, this framework is actually quite general. You can do a lot of things. Yeah. Yeah. Assuming proof of like this, want to make sure what cannot be learned, cannot learn. We'll get there. So you'll see that you cannot. But you can expand your state space and learn loops. All right. I guess you're asking because of cell cycle, right? Yeah. Yeah, you can do cell cycle. All right. So the way we're going to modify this is to introduce a Lagrange multiplier. So we're going to keep this constraint, the first one. But the second one, we're going to add a set of Lagrange multipliers omega g. So technically, you want to impose this constraint. Where the initial constraint is still true. Right? But this is really a constant. We don't care about that, so we can ignore that. This is how you introduce Lagrange multipliers, right? So omega is the Lagrange multiplier. So we're going to ignore this because it's just a constant. It doesn't really affect the optimization process. So ultimately, you get an objective which looks like this with this constraint. This constraint, right? So that's really the problem we're going to solve. The issue here is that, so we've kind of converted this to a standard stochastic control problem where you want to minimize the quadratic cost and you get a reward of omega at the final state. This is really classic control, except there's one hitch, which is that you don't know what omega is. It's a Lagrange multiplier. So it's an inverse problem. You have to solve for the boundary after you solve for the full problem. So that's what you kind of lose by formulating it this way. But this is nice. It turns out that there's a framework for solving this. And we're going to go through the math associated with that framework. Yeah. Any questions here? Yeah. This particular thing have a different diffusion, so that's the reason it's taken. I'm saying no loops for a different reason, which I'll get to. Yeah. Yeah.
The velocities are, this Euclidean space. So presumably generalize this to
Yeah.
a nonlinear particle, right?
Yep. Folks have done like metric. Yeah. Yeah, you can generalize this to continuous time discrete Markov chains, to different manifolds, and you can derive algorithms to fit neural networks to these velocity fields. Like for instance, if you want to generate molecules, you want kind of, it's in a arbitrary space. And this also, by the way, this is also the framework that is used for generating protein structures using AlphaFold, right? So quite powerful. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead to the solution of this. It's going to get a little bit technical, so please stop me if there's any questions. The way to solve these problems is to define, so there's really three tricks. Okay, so the first trick is to define something known as a value function. It turns out to be a very powerful quantity to introduce. I'm going to call it W, GP. What this value function represents is the expected reward given that you're a particle with state G at time t. Okay? So given that you're here, what do you do next? So it turns out that you can formulate the global optimization problem in terms of a local optimization problem once you start thinking about this. And you write down a recursive equation for this, and this recursive equation is known as dynamic programming. I mean, you don't need to know the terminology, but that's what it's called. So this recursive equation is that you maximize the decision that you make, V. This is the local cost that you pay in choosing V. Plus, once you pay this cost, you move on to a different state, the next state. And so you have the expected reward given the next state. So this is a recursive equation. And I'm writing down this expectation value over here because the dynamics is stochastic over there. So it's the same ensemble that you're averaging over. Okay. So this is known as the Bellman equation or the Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation. It's really the Hamilton-Jacobi equation if you're familiar with that. Okay. So now if you look at this term, you can Taylor expand it. So expected value of G plus DG, T plus DT is in time and in G. Okay, this is just standard Taylor expansion and nothing new there. And you need to keep second order contributions because DG square is going to get a contribution of order DT. Right? That's the standard way you do these things. And so this one, the expected value of DG is just the drift. So you get a V from here and V dt over here. And from here is just a diffusion term. And so this is just a dt. And you just take you square the left-hand side over there, take the expectation, and you get a dt over here. Now you can take the dt outside. You can plug this back in over here. So you get WGT is equal to W dt. I'm going to kind of take all the terms that are independent of V outside. Okay, so those are all the terms independent of V, and all the terms sorry, this is not optimal. Okay. So I've just taken out all the terms which have the V dependence and taken out all the ones that don't. Right? Just rewrote what is over here, what we have here. Okay. This is all fine. This is actually really fine because if you look at this, what's the optimal value of V over here? It's just the gradient of W with respect to G. So if you take the derivative of this quantity with respect to V and set it to 0, you get a nice optimality condition, which is that the optimal V is the gradient of W. And this is why you can't have loops, right? So this is also true in high dimensions. So it's the gradient of some potential. And so you don't get loops. Okay. And this is why the Warrington picture also kind of comes out naturally.
That directly comes from the fact that we have.
Yeah, and the quadratic cost. So now you plug this back in over here, and you get a PDE. So first thing you can do is you can cancel out these terms, and everything is of order dt. So you can collect all the terms of order dt and set them to 0. You're going to get a PDE, which is unfortunately a little bit annoying. So if you plug this back in over here, you'll see that you get plus half . So if we can solve for W, we're done, right? So if you can solve for W, you can just take the gradient of W with respect to G and we're done. But unfortunately, this is a nonlinear partial differential equation. And most nonlinear partial differential equations don't have easy ways to solve for them, especially in high dimensions. But this particular one, we can do something with it. Okay? It turns out that there's a particular transformation of variables that works out quite well. This is known as the Cole-Hop transform. Yeah. Yeah, just plug this back in over here. And you get a half because you get a minus half here and there's a 1 here. Okay. This is known as a Cole-Hop transform. You might have seen this before because it also appears in fluid mechanics when you're analyzing the Burger's equation. Okay, so this transform, basically, it's quite simple. It's just saying W. You're going to set WGT is equal to log of some other function psi GT. I just realized this psi, there's also a psi over there. Before anyone asks, this is a different psi. Okay. Right, so this is the transform that we want. So I was planning on going through the math and showing that if you apply this transform, you're going to get something nice here. But in fact, I'm going to skip that. That's just, straightforward manipulations. But believe me, if you kind of plug this in over here, what you're going to get is, in fact, a linear PDE of this form. So you kind of entirely get rid of the nonlinear part of this original PDE. This transform is very well known in many fields. This is also a transform used to analyze a KPZ equation, if you're familiar with that. And this is really one of the few transforms you can use to kind of reduce nonlinear PDEs. Okay. This equation is very nice. This is basically the backward heat equation, if you're familiar with that, right? So the heat equation has a minus sign over here. If you have a plus sign, it's basically describing the backward process. It's basically saying that if you have a point over here, what is the ensemble of particles that got to that particular point sometime t later, right? So you're kind of keeping track of all the bubble of particles that ended up there later, right? So that's kind of what this keeps track of. Okay, so this is nice. This is the second non-trivial technical. W is the expected reward given that the particle is at state G and at time t for the optimal action, optimal policy. Yeah.
How do you connect this back to the generative model that you might use fully
generative modeling, they do things slightly differently. First they assume it's a Gaussian distribution usually. I mean, you can do it for general pairs, but they're usually assuming it's a Gaussian distribution. They also don't solve an optimal transport problem. It's kind of often thought they're solving an optimal transport problem, but they're not. They're solving a conditional optimal transport problem. And that makes things a lot simpler. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So you take the derivative of this. You want to maximize this quantity. So you take the derivative of this with respect to v and set it to 0. And so this term will give you a minus v, and this term will give you a dou w or dou g, and so you equate them, you get this. Okay, so this equation, there's a particular way to rewrite this equation in integral form. You don't have to know this. I'm just going to write it out because it makes things clearer. This is known as the Feynman-Crack formula, if you've heard of this. It's used quite a bit in finance, for instance, and also in statistical mechanics. This is basically going from partial differential equations to path integrals, right? So this is really the formula that you use. This expresses the function psi as an integral right? So the intuition is actually quite simple. This is saying that if you start with a particle at state g at time t, what is the probability that you'll end up at g prime, some time capital T minus t later, times the value at the boundary, right? So this is expressing it that way. You can take the derivative with respect to time, the derivative with respect to g, and show that this is true by just plugging this back in over here. But what this tells you is that once you know the boundary term, you're done, right? So if you know the boundary term, you use this expression to calculate psi. You don't have to solve the PD. This really, you can solve this, you can get this quantity by sampling many trajectories, for example, so there's no question of dimensionality. You just do this. Once you have this, you take the derivative with respect to g, and you're done, right? Remember that w is log psi. Okay, so now we've reduced the problem to finding this boundary psi. Okay, that all seems good. Yeah. Yeah.
The equation of figuring out the Lagrange multipliers will vary about later.
We're going to do that next because the Lagrange multipliers. So this, if you remember, is e raised to w gt. But w at gt is exactly the Lagrange multiplier. It's the reward at capital time t, at the final time point, right? So this omega over here is really the reward that you get at the very end. I should have written that there, but actually it's good that you asked. So this is actually e raised to omega g. So finding this omega, the Lagrange multipliers, is equivalent to finding the psi at the boundary. Okay, so how do you find psi? Yeah. Yeah, omega is the reward that you get at the final time capital T. W is the expected reward given that you're at state g at time t, small t, but at capital T, it's exactly the same because you're going to receive the reward that you would have achieved if you had went to that state. Yeah, you're collecting the reward. Yeah. This one? Yeah, this is the diffusion kernel. So if you're diffusing, this is a heat equation, which is diffusion. And when you're diffusing, the mean remains the same and the variance goes as the time. And the time between capital T and T is capital T minus small t. So that's how you get this. And it's a Gaussian distribution. Sorry, I should have explained that. This is actually one place where you do need to know some, you can solve this very generally, but you don't always get the heat equation depending on how you kind of set up the problem. And so you do need to figure out what the transition kernel is. And that you can only solve for certain sets of problems. It's still a linear equation, but you might have to do certain. Okay, Now is, yeah. You could solve the PD as it is, but the reason I like to write it this way is because you can sample. It kind of really says that you can start from G at small time t and sample a bunch of trajectories and get the estimate of psi, which is really helpful in high dimensionals when you're in large sets of. Yeah, there are the other possibilities to take the integral, and if your dimensionality is very high, you have to kind of discretize your space, and often you can't do that. Okay. All right, so this is the third kind of technical trick that we have to use in order to find these boundary conditions. And this one is pure magic, right? So Schrödinger figured it out in the 1930s. I have no idea why, because you'll see. Okay, so what Schrödinger did was to define so this is the backward heat equation, and you can also define a quantity that satisfies the forward heat equation, which is just this. Right, so this is a standard heat equation that you've seen in many places. And so this psi hat, you can write down the same integral version of this for the psi hat. And this is the forward process, right? So this is describing where particles would end up given that they started at some state G. So this one, you can write it as so this is basically saying that if you're a particle that started at G prime at time t equal to 0, evolved according to the diffusion equation, where do you end up? So this is the solution for this. For this, you need to know at the psi hat at the initial time point. Okay, this is the ansatz. Okay, so the Schrödinger realized that under the optimal control, the density of the process, so rho gt. So basically, the thing that satisfies this Fokker-Planck equation over here is simply psi gt times psi hat gt. Okay, and this you can verify. I'm not going to go through the derivation. It's really not very hard. It's hard to see that this is the solution, but verifying it is easy. So you kind of plug this back in over here. You plug in v equal to the partial derivative of log psi dg, and everything cancels out, right? So you can show that this plus this will satisfy this equation at optimality. You know, how you find this, I have no idea. Talking about guesses, but this is basically the insight, right? And you can kind of guess where the name comes from, why Schrödinger was excited about this, right? Because Schrödinger was kind of upset about quantum mechanics, right? So he had written down the Schrödinger equation, but he was annoyed that the probability density of the wave function is the product of some wave function times its adjoint. So he wanted to construct a process where this is the solution, and he came up with this problem. Okay? So that's basically the history of this thing. But then he couldn't really do much with it, so he kind of left it alone. The title of the paper is called "On the Time Reversal of Natural Laws," I think, something like that. So he really was thinking about reversibility. And that also kind of came to fore in the last few years. But yeah, incredible paper. All right, so that's it. So that's basically it. With this, you can do something. With this, you can derive an algorithm. It took about 20 years to prove that this algorithm works. So it's non-trivial. So I wouldn't, try to kind of rationalize it. If I write here, is it still visible? I'm going to maybe write it much larger than usual. So what this implies is that now you can kind of fix the boundary conditions. So if you plug in t equal to 0, you get this. If you plug in t equal to capital P, okay. So you want to solve these two equations. But it looks like you have 4 quantities and two equations. But actually, you only have 2 independent quantities that you need to solve, because once you know this, you can get this using this equation. And once you know this, you can get this using the backward equation. Okay, so in fact, it's a closed set of equations that you can solve. The way you solve it is an iterative scheme. It's known as the Sinkhorn algorithm, or it was rediscovered in the electrical engineering community. It's called iterative proportional fitting. There's some nice historical comments about this that one could make, but I'm going to skip that. The procedure is quite simple. What you do is that you kind of guess an initial value of psi. So first thing you do is guess some psi gt. So you kind of start with an initial guess for the solution. Now, once you have psi gt, I'm going to call this equation 1 and this is equation 2. So use equation 1 to get psi g0. Okay. And I'm going to call this 3 and 4. Once you have psi g0, use equation 3 to get psi hat g0. Because you know this. Now you know this, so you can get this. Once you have this, you can use equation 2 to get psi hat gt. And finally, you can update your initial estimate of psi gt using equation 4. Use equation 4 to get psi. And you iterate this. So you go through steps 1 through 4, and you keep iterating through this process, and you can show, which is the non-trivial part, you can show mathematically that this scheme converges. And there's neural network versions of this. You kind of form this bridge. It's called a bridge because you're kind of forming a bridge between two distributions. You start with an initial guess, you fit a neural network to it, and then you kind of use that neural network to find a new estimate of the bridge, and you keep iterating it, and you can show it converges. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, most things work out. Like, actually, not even most, everything works out. Whether you can actually solve for the transition kernel that comes up here, that's a different question. But because most of these methods also work by sampling, like you can just sample stuff. So in many cases, you don't even have to solve for the transition kernel. You can just sample stuff and get away with it. So of course, a lot simpler. Here, you sample particles, diffusing particles. Right, so you start with, sorry? Yeah, which is why I kind of wrote down the explicit form, but even if you don't, you can just simulate them and sample and compute the expectation using Monte Carlo, right? Okay, so that's pretty much it. Once you have this, you compute your psi, you get your velocity field. The reason I kind of mentioned, just kind of iterate the Waddington landscapes is because this is the gradient of the log of psi. How much time do I have? Oh, actually, I have plenty of time. I want to kind of illustrate how this works in one particular special case where you can derive everything analytically. So maybe I'll do that.
So,
Yeah.
question. Fine. Now, supposing you have this data,
Yeah.
right? You have this data at time 0 and at capital T. Where is that being used to get the?
Yeah, for when you're analyzing data, you can write down the empirical distribution, which is the sum of delta functions. And you can proceed with this procedure. There are certain simplifications you can make because it's a discrete distribution. And so the psi and psi hat have masses only at the discrete points. And then basically you're kind of solving for the coefficients of those discrete. So basically you're going to get a psi hat, psi gt, which looks like a sum of I delta, if you have n particles, right? You get something like this. And then you fit your W's. Because you're, yeah, that's a bit tricky. So there's an extension of that called unbalanced optimal transport, where you don't need to have an exact match, but you penalize the mismatch. So there's a paper from the Broad Institute. It's kind of very well known at this point, which analyzed this, which applied this framework on single cell RNA-seq data. It's a 2019 Cell paper, I think. And in their paper, you also have growth. So cells are actually growing. And the way they did this is to kind of put in some markers for growth and correct for growth using those markers. So they kind of put in extra, parts to the experiment itself to control for things.
I'm asking this, what we're doing now with the signal of
Yes.
it's not the same term.
Well, okay, so there's two versions of optimal transport. One is a stochastic version of things, which has noise. So you're mapping one point to densities. But there's a deterministic version of it, which is what people typically use. And there you're mapping point to point. Here you're mapping a point to, yeah. Well, the hope is that you're mapping to the same cells. Yeah.
It's generalizable to a different generative model for each. I can pick different laws of physics.
Yes, you can. So the things that you can do are you can add another time-dependent term here, growth term, which does not go through a control cost, so that distinguishes your V and F. And you can solve this for any arbitrary. You can also have a matrix over here, so the noise is correlated. In that case, you get a diffusion tensor. And you can solve for that as well. The modification that you get is that your optimal control is going to be some metric times the gradient of log psi. And it kind of reflects what Archishman was talking about yesterday. So you get this extra metric that shapes the landscape. Yeah.
So I guess this was asked, right? The same cell problem, right? If you change the space, let's say you do some nonlinear transform of the G space that you were embedding stuff in.
Yeah.
Does the solution change in the sense that which cell gets mapped to which cell? Does that get flipped around in your optimal answer depending on?
I can imagine scenarios for, like, in the extreme scenario where you map everything to the same point, you're kind of destroying a lot of information. I'm pretty sure it changes things, but I'm not sure like how much. Right? Probably context depends on how you transform stuff. Yeah. There's no wrong questions. Yeah. So the prior is, what do you mean by the prior? So one way I think about the prior is to think of this F extra drift term as a prior. This is basically saying if you didn't have a control, you would have expected particles to go this way, and your control is going to deviate your particles from that expect. This is essentially the prior, and in this formalism, this can be time dependent. So it doesn't have to be time independent. So if you kind of want to connect it to what Archishman was saying yesterday, basically the F would have all the attractors, right? And this velocity field is the one that kind of biases you from one to the other. Yeah. So I think I only have like 3 minutes, even though I was, so one way to, I can just describe what I was going to say pictorially. I think you're going to get the same insight and you're also going to remember. Oh, okay. Now I'm conflicted. Okay, and I'm actually just going to give you the pictorial thing because I think it's easier to remember anyway. So one nice thing about this framework is that when your initial, so this framework works for arbitrary initial and final distributions, but when the initial distribution is a multi-Gaussian mixture, so it's a mixture of different Gaussians, and the final is also a mixture of different Gaussians, you can solve this exactly. You can solve for everything exactly. So that's really nice. But I'm just going to show you pictorially how the landscape looks like in these scenarios. So let's say you start from a Gaussian over here, and you want to diversify into, 2 distinct modes, something like here, right? Now, the classical way of sampling from this kind of distribution is that you define an energy landscape, which is negative log probability of this, and you do Monte Carlo, Markov chain Monte Carlo, which came up in one of the other lectures. The problem with that is that if you're stuck here, you might be stuck there for a long time, and you also might fall a lot more often here than here. So you might be biased in your sampling. Okay? So what this does is to anneal the sampling process by slowly transforming your energy landscape from something that looks like a parabola because it's the negative log of the Gaussian to something that looks like a bistable potential. So you're going to get initially an energy landscape. So I'm going to draw energy landscapes with blue. Whenever I use colors, I get higher ratings on my teaching evaluations. So great. So you start with a parabola, and at some point, so this parabola in practice expands, and at some point there's a bifurcation. There's a bifurcation like this. So this is, the decision point of where the cell or whatever particle is making a decision, and then eventually you're going to get bistable potential. And this really ensures that you're not as biased as you would if you'd done Markov chain Monte Carlo. And in the scenario where these two are perfectly symmetric, you're going to get, I think, a pitchfork bifurcation over here. The reason Archishman said those don't appear, because he only said there's saddle node and heteroclonic flips, is because it's structurally unstable. Because if you kind of modify this a little bit, things are going to fail. In most scenarios, what's going to happen is that these two are not symmetric. And in those cases, you get a saddle node bifurcation, which is, exactly kind of the class of things that we heard yesterday. Okay, I think I'll stop here. I'm actually exactly on time, the real time. Oh yeah. So okay, yeah, right.
Very nice. I have this question, and I think you know where I'm going. So the canonical diffusion problems
you sort of you take the picture and you would take the two wells, put the noise, and then you come back. And that, I'm guessing that solution is exactly
No, that solution turns out to be not the
the learned solution where you look at the backward and forward and map it together.
So if you take this bistable thing, for example, and you noise it using some arbitrary autoregressive noise, and you get a Gaussian, the reverse process that you get is not the one that solves the optimal transport problem.
Okay, so good. So this particular case, like the way you drew it out right
Yeah.
now, that's what I want. So even though you talked about the psi and psi adjoint, the conclusion that I shouldn't take away from this is that the adjoint is doing some time reversal.
Yeah.
Okay, I shouldn't take that. But is there something close to it that it does?
There's one in quantum mechanics. So there's an interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's called the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics. So the idea is that you want to go from this state to this state, but instead you can think of the forward as coming from here, and the reverse the reverse coming from here, and they kind of meet in between. I don't know. It's
That's that interpretation.
yeah. So they think about it there, but I haven't seen like a diffusion version of that, for instance. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So you're right. In fact, it took me a while to actually understand that and clarify it. So the way to kind of reconcile, so I guess I'm going to rephrase the question and let me know if I got it right. So for example, in Archishman's picture, the cell types are already there, and you're just tilting stuff. And here, I'm basically saying you're creating fixed points as a function of time. One way to kind of go back to their framework is to put all the fixed points in F, and everything else is just basically biasing towards one of the fixed points. So fixed points are always there. You're just kind of moving things around. So I haven't actually kind of worked out whether things will indeed pan out. It's just something I realized yesterday. But I think that's something that, you know, that's how I'm reconciling them. But one would still need to work that out.
Thing between F and B, right? So F is sort of this prime, right? If you
Yeah.
just let the system go on its own.
Yeah.
This is what it would do.
Yes.
And B is sort of coming because now you've sampled something. Now you've, is that how one would think about it? Because you're conditioned now to what you sampled rather than sort of.
I don't think of V like that. So I think V, so here V is a function of time, right? But time really doesn't make sense in development. Like there's potentially like this time is actually the concentration of some external field that is potentially self-generated or externally imposed. So I think a natural extension of this framework, which turns out to be quite hard to do in practice, but we are trying, is to kind of get rid of this time factor and assume that this time is created by some external signal, endogenous or exogenous. Yeah.
So this work from a few folks in France, and Julian, where they looked at the sampling properties of, you know, that kind of fusion system, but with F that have curls. And the generic claim was you do that, you sample much better. And sample better, much better. Why, how, the mystery, but you can sort of go to class even much faster. So like if this whole formulation you sort of didn't have F first, and they said you have to put that in, do your notions of what optimality look like change?
Everything looks the same. Yeah, everything looks the same. You're going to get an extra F times dW or dou G term in the PDE over here. Where are we? How far? So you basically get like a plus F here. And if you, the substitution still works. And now here you're going to get an F times dou psi over dou G. But for arbitrary F, it's going to be hard to find the transition kernel. But that's really the only problem. Everything else works out. Oh yeah, the Feynman calc is like general, like this is just a solution. I think we should probably end here because we're over time and we're getting back at 11.